Welcome back. The title for this evening's talk is Why Buddhism and the West Need Each Other. West here referring to Western civilization, such as includes the United States. And the talk is inspired or motivated by something that Gary Snyder wrote about way back in the 1950s. He published an essay on Buddhist anarchism, which included these well-known words. Make sure I get them right. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been individual insight into the basic self void. I think today we might say insight, personal, individual insight into the emptiness of the self. And then he said, we need both. Another way to put it is that the highest ideal of the Western tradition has been social transformation. Again, the emphasis is on ideal, right? The idea that we can restructure our societies, the way that we live together, so they are more socially just. On the other side, the Buddhist side, the most important goal for Buddhism is to awaken, and in Zen terms, to realize our true nature, which puts an end to dukkha, at least the dukkha associated with the delusion of a separate self. And today, I think it has become more and more obvious that we need both. Not simply because they go well together, but actually each project, if you want to call it that, needs the other if it's going to be as successful as we need it to be. That's the basic idea. As far as I can tell, the Western idea of justice, the Western conception of justice, especially social justice, we can trace it back to the Abrahamic traditions, especially the Old Testament prophets, who fulminated against the oppressive rulers of their time, right? Criticized them for afflicting, taking advantage of the poor and the powerless. Walter Kaufmann has written about that prophecy, quote, "No other sacred scripture contains books that speak out against social injustice as eloquently, as unequivocally and sensitively as the books of Moses and some of the prophets." But what about Buddhism? Is there a Buddhist equivalent? Well, I suppose if we look for an equivalent, it would have to be something like the karma teaching. But actually, karma seems to work in a rather different way, doesn't it? Karma is sort of social justice is built into the structure of the universe, which means we don't actually have to worry about it in the sense that everyone tends to get what they deserve sooner or later, which kind of takes the pressure off in terms of our having to work for social justice, right? This has encouraged passivity and accepting our situation rather than actually girding us up to sort of fight for social justice. So maybe karma is not the best equivalent. What about dukkha? I wonder, is that a better equivalent to the Western conception of justice? I mean, it's arguably the single most important concept in Buddhism, right? I mean, if you think about it, Buddhism, certainly most explicitly in early Buddhism, it's all about dukkha, suffering, the cause of dukkha, suffering, the end, and then how to end it with the Eightfold Path. So I think it's pretty clear dukkha is the single most important concept in Buddhism. That's pretty clear. Historically, though, Asian Buddhism has focused on individual dukkha and individual karma, a limitation that may well have been necessary given the kinds of political systems that Buddhism lived in Asia, right? None of them was a democracy. And so that made a difference in terms of what you could do, what you could try to do. You had to be very careful. If you wanted to survive and thrive, you needed at least the tolerance and hopefully the support of the kings and the autocrats. And so that would make a difference in terms of how much you would criticize them. Today, of course, though, the globalization, I guess you could call it the globalization of the West in the sense of the understanding, at least in some general sense, that, how to say it, the idea of free speech, that we should be able to talk freely. I mean, I think that's more international now, even when it's sinned against. At least there's that idea that's out there. The idea of democracy, even if we don't actually have real democracy, that's there. This, and the human rights discourse, of course, that opens the door to new ways of responding to institutional types of dukkha, such as we're going to be talking more and more about. But on the other side, the Abrahamic focus on justice in combination with the Greek realization. See, this is the other thing. The Greeks realized, and I think this is one of the reasons we trace back Western Civ, on the one hand, to the Abrahamic, on the one side. Are you happy about the microphone? What shall we do?
It's rubbing against something.
I think so.
There's a piece of tape that was loose. Yeah, this is dukkha, let me tell you.
For everybody, sorry.
Yeah. That's better. I think that'll work better. Okay. Try this. Let's try that.
I'll try to keep upright. So on the one hand, yeah, as I was saying, that we tend to trace Western Civ back to this double influence, the Abrahamic on the one side, right, Judeo-Christianity, and on the other side, the Greeks. And the reason is, if you think about the Greeks, they were the ones who made this kind of momentous discovery. They're the ones who realized that how we live together is not sort of predetermined in the way that, say, ecosystems are, that if we're not happy with the way we're living together, we can restructure. And they created, as far as we know, at least in our historical influence, they created the first democracy. Admittedly, not a very good one. You know, women and slaves need not apply, that kind of thing. But the ideal is still there, and it was the possibility, there was always the possibility of expanding it, which is what has happened. And I think it's important for us to recognize and appreciate, even though we're very aware of the limitations, and it's important that we're aware of the limitations, I think we need to also pat ourselves in the back in the sense of appreciate just how much has been achieved in a relatively short historical period, right? If you think about it, think of how within the last 200 years, basically slavery was abolished, and then we had civil rights movement. It's not to say racism is gone, but at least the slavery, right? Not only that, think of the labor unions, which for a long time were not tolerated. Women's rights, right? Think it wasn't all that long ago that women were allowed to vote for the first time. And then more recently, what you might consider sort of gender and sexual rights, right? I remember when I was in college, one of my good friends, I had no idea he was gay because he was not comfortable coming out. And now, you know, gay people can get married. And then we have all these other issues with gender fluidity and in other words, a lot has happened really quickly, and we're super aware of where the resistance is. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot to appreciate there, just in a relatively short period of time, in terms of not an awful lot of lifetimes, generations. And frankly, I think that probably is one of the big reasons why there's so much resistance. It's like some traditional people, it's just happening so quickly, and it's really hard for some of them to sort of adjust to that. Yeah? As valuable as it has been, though, I think, as I've been alluding to, I think the limitations of this kind of institutional approach are becoming more and more evident. And one of the main points here, I think, is that even the best possible economic and political system that we can imagine, it cannot be expected to function well if the people that are running the system are still motivated by greed, ill will, delusion. And in fact, historically, this is a fact too. It's interesting that pro-social movements like democracy, in the long run, they have tended to be subverted. Powerful people have figured out how to take advantage of them. And in fact, I wonder if that's a pretty good description for what's happening right now, to be quite frank about it. The implication being that maybe if we want our economic and political systems to function well, we also need to think about the nature of the individuals who are running them, who are living within them, whether there isn't a need to transform our greed into generosity, our ill will, aggression into loving kindness, and our delusion, especially delusions of separation, into an appreciation of our interdependence. And today, in our globalizing world, the traditional Western focus on social transformation is encountering, and here we are. I mean, we're an important part of that encounter, just us being here together. It's encountering this traditional Buddhist focus on individual awakening. And basically, what I'm trying to talk about today, what I want to emphasize is how each of these projects needs the other in order to fully actualize its own ideals. But we also need to highlight the differences, because I think those are very revealing. But let me just do a reality check so far. Do you get a sense of where I'm at here? And basically the idea is I want to flesh that out, because I think there's some important insights on both sides that can be very helpful to us, right? Fundamentally, I think the difference between the traditional Western approach and the traditional Buddhist one, it can be traced back to some different paradigms. And in particular, I think we can trace it back to the different attitudes toward morality, right? So the Abrahamic traditions, for example, are like the prime examples of theism and ethical monotheism, because they emphasize most of all ethical behavior. That's like the core, that's at the heart of what it means, right, to be a Christian, to be a Judeo-Christian. If you think about God's main way of relating to us, his creatures, is instructing us how to live, right? He tells us how to live. He gives us commandments. To be a good Jew, Christian, or Muslim is to follow his rules. Again, the traditional male pronoun, right? The fundamental axis, therefore, for the Judeo-Christian is good versus evil. Doing what God wants to do, in which case we'll be rewarded. And if we disobey him, then we know we're going to get into trouble sooner or later, right? And actually, it's interesting how for some people, especially more on the evangelical side, they tend to see the whole world in these terms, right? This world is a battleground between the forces of evil and the forces of God. And that's the way they define, the sort of way they understand what it means to be living in the world today. If we go back to the very beginnings of the Bible, I alluded earlier today to the story of Adam and Eve. and how, from a Buddhist perspective, you could see that as a story about the development of self-consciousness, how it is that they expelled themselves from the garden by becoming, sort of experiencing the world in a more dualistic way. But hey, that's not how it's usually presented, right? The problem is a moral one. They disobeyed God, even though there's kind of a contradiction here, right? In the sense that it's only as a result of that they learn about good and evil. So is God punishing them, for the wrong reason, right? It's like when they eat the fruit, their eyes are opened and they realize. But before that, did they even know that it was bad to disobey God? I mean, anyway, we won't go into that one. And then it carries on, right? What about Noah's Ark? God sends a great flood that destroys everyone except the people in the ark who were, I guess, pretty righteous. In my opinion, a bit of an overreaction, in all honesty, if you think about it. In fact, I wonder what kind of God would drown so many animals as well. I think there's some issues there. Simply because people aren't living in the way that he would like us to. And then Jesus comes along, don't want to skip Moses, right? I don't want to skip Moses. And of course the idea of Moses, that's where God really speaks to the Hebrew peoples and gives 10 specific laws, right? The Decalogue. Then Jesus comes along, and with some help from Paul, according to my New Testament scholar friends, he adds the emphasis on loving one another, which nonetheless does not abrogate this earlier focus on good versus evil, right? Now, why am I going on and on about this? Especially because many people nowadays don't sort of buy into those stories so much. But here's the important point, I think. We are still living in a kind of Judeo-Christian world because this is still our favorite story. Good versus evil. We love it, right? It's the main theme of just about all the most popular novels, films, and TV shows, right? I mean, just think for a moment. James Bond, Star Wars, Harry Potter, not to mention almost every detective novel and spy. And I'm sure we can think of lots more examples. What am I leaving out? I'm sure there's some more recent ones. Sorry? Lord of the Rings. There we go. Right? We love this story. And, in a way I can see there's something very simple and very pleasing and kind of grounding about it. But here's the irony. The story of good and evil is itself, I think, good and evil. That is to say, there's some really good things about it, but there's also some really problematical things about it, right? Because it's kind of the perfect example of what Buddhism critiques as bipolar thinking, right? I mean, Buddhism has a lot to say about delusion, different types of delusion, and one of the really problematic forms of that is dualistic thinking. And the bipolar thinking where it seems like we have two separate things, but in fact, they're two sides of the same thing. To give some fairly innocuous examples, big, small. Two concepts, right? No, not really. Two sides of the same concept. Huh? If you don't know what big is, you don't really understand what small means, and vice versa. They always go together. You can't have one without the other because the meaning of each is the negation of the other, right? Now, most of the time, that's no big deal. But sometimes it causes problems because, guess what? We want one and we don't want the other. But you can't have one without the other. They always come together, right? Think about wealth and poverty. Yeah, a lot of us want wealth. We don't want poverty. But once you get into that craving, you're going to have to accept the shadow side of wealth, the possibility of poverty. You're playing a dualistic game there. Or maybe a more relevant example, purity, impurity. the fact that those are a bipolar pair, that you can't have one without the other, means if you want to live a pure life, whatever that means, you can define it in any way you want, it means you're going to be preoccupied with impurity, right? With avoiding impurity. You're going to be in a situation where you have to constantly discriminate. Is this a pure, is this an impure thing to do? You can't get away from it if you're really wanting to be pure. Which is why one of the great Chinese Chan masters, I think it was Hui Hai, said that true purity is to live beyond the duality of purity and impurity. Yeah? Typical Zen sort of way of putting it, right? Right? And I think he's right. The problem with good versus evil is that it's really kind of the paradigm. In fact, we could say kind of the most problematical example of bipolar thinking. Because their interdependence means we don't know what's good until we know what's evil. And if you really want to be good, the best thing is to be fighting against the evil, right? Just think about the Judeo-Christian tradition, how it's not enough to have a God. If you have a God who's all loving, all knowing, all powerful, well, somewhere you're going to have to create the other side. You're going to have to create a devil, a Satan. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And then people see the world in terms of this struggle. It doesn't really make sense in one way because God is all powerful, right? It's like, and then they get these weird contortions like he lets the devil, but until, it just doesn't really make sense is the true story, I think. But if you look at the way it plays out historically, say in European history, think about, again, to be really good is to be fighting against evil. Well, what does that mean? What has it meant? Think about inquisitions, right? Heresy trials, witchcraft trials. And most recently, what about the war on terror? What was the difference? Maybe this is a little bit dated now, but I think we all remember well enough. What was the difference between Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush? They were both fighting the same holy war of good against evil. The difference is that what the one thought was good, the other thought was evil. But nonetheless, although they had their different sides on it, it was still the same struggle between good and evil. And here's what's tricky. Once you have successfully labeled something as evil, you don't have to understand it. You're not expected to have any empathy. If it's evil, by definition, it needs to be destroyed, right? And that's where it becomes very problematical. That's what the forces of evil are supposed to do. And this illustrates a kind of tragic paradox that historically, one of the main causes of evil in our world has been our attempts to get rid of evil. And you don't have to be especially religious in the usual sense to see how that's played out. What was Hitler trying to do? In a way, he was trying to sort of purify the earth of its impure elements, the Jews, the Romani, gypsies, and so forth, the homosexuals, yeah. What about Stalin with the kulaks in the Soviet Union, right? Trying to make his ideal society, right? Or Mao Zedong in China, the landlords. It's the same process, whether you understand it in religious terms or more secular. The attempt to create a perfectly good society. Guess what? You've got to destroy the things that are getting in the way. Resulting in incalculable dukkha for many, many millions of people. So that's the problematical side, and I think it's really worth emphasizing that good versus evil so often plays out as this really good example of bipolar thinking. But nonetheless, there's this other side, such as we already alluded to, the Abrahamic concern for social justice, right? That brings us back to the Hebrew prophets. Amos castigating those who trample the head of the poor into the dust and crush the needy. Isaiah complaining about those who write oppressive laws. Both speak on behalf of God, and both address themselves primarily to rulers who are abusing their power. The idea that rulers, it's like God is so high, so transcendent, in a way that levels the rulers and the people. They're subject to the same law. Of course, many more examples could be cited from the Bible. Speaking truth to power, the prophets called for social justice for the oppressed, and not just in the Bible. We have many modern examples. Martin Luther King, of course, would be one of the great ones of our time, pointing to the problem of what might be called social dukkha. Now, we've talked a lot about the Western tradition. I am not aware of anything comparable in Buddhist history that doesn't play out in the same way at all. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that. There may be a few counterexamples, but even so, they didn't influence the tradition in the way that the Hebrew prophets did, right? According to the Pali Canon, the Buddha did talk to kings, they consulted him, but nonetheless, I'm not aware of any cases where he sort of challenged them in the way that, say, Amos or Isaiah would, They would, God is going to punish you for living, taking advantage of people that way, and then they would run back into the fields and all that. The Buddha didn't talk that way, at least we don't have any record of that in the Pali Canon, right? Nor did the sangha do so after he died, right? I'll come back to Buddhism in a moment, but let's just return to the highest ideal of the Western tradition, this concern for social justice. We've had now over 2,000 years for that to play itself out, right? And as a result, everything is just fine, right? Right? I didn't think I'd have to push you very hard on that one. Even with the best ideals, what might be considered our collective intentions, our societies have not become as socially just as most of us would like. And in several ways, I think they're becoming more unjust, right? And that's a pretty scary thing. I mean, economically, this already obscene and still growing gap between rich and poor, it's almost unbelievable. But also, if we think about politically, a couple years ago, Chomsky, I don't remember if I alluded to him earlier, but in the early days of the pandemic, Chomsky, in an interview, mentioned that this is the most dangerous time in human history. And he wasn't talking about the pandemic. He talked about the climate crisis. He talked about nuclear weapons. And he also talked about the rise of authoritarianism and the decline of democracy. And he was talking about this well before January 6th, right? Now, in some ways, we've survived certain pretty scary moments, but his point is still valid, that if you look around the world, it seems like there has been a retreat from democracy, and that we have many cases where leaders have come to power democratically, and then once they're in power, they've really made efforts to restructure so that they stay in power. They don't give up their power. I think Chomsky is right there. So we have this problem, right? But it's certainly clear that as it stands now, our economic system is becoming increasingly divisive and exploitive. We can say In fact, I don't like to talk about democracy anymore. I don't think we're really a democracy in all honesty. I think we're a plutocracy. If you think about the way it works in terms of the way that wealthy people can use their money, both legally and illegally, to influence the democratic process. So we still vote, but in a way that's a kind of a form that is already very much manipulated just by the way that the Supreme Court has allowed sort of infinite amounts of money to function, right? And I think we need to keep that in mind. You know, we've become a plutocracy. As a very good example of what I was alluding to earlier, the way that in all pro-social societies, what seems to happen in the long run is that powerful people tend to find ways to subvert them. And I think that's happened, or is happening now, right? Is the basic difficulty here that our economic and political institutions are not structured well enough to avoid those kind of manipulations? Or is it the case that they cannot be structured so perfectly that this kind of thing can be indefinitely avoided? In other words, can we really rely completely on an institutional solution to structural injustice? Can we create a social order so perfect that it will run itself without requiring people of goodwill to be in charge? In short, can the social transformations that our ideals seek be successful without also considering the importance of personal transformation, right? And I think you can see where I'm going with this, why it is that the Western needs the Eastern, why it is that the kind of social ideals that we have and cherish and try to fulfill seem to require some personal transformation as well. Does this help us understand why so many political revolutions end up replacing one gang of thugs with another? Suppose I'm a revolutionary leader who somehow manages to overthrow an oppressive regime. Maybe Castro? If I have not also worked on my own motivations, my own greed, ill will, and delusion, I will be sorely tempted to take personal advantage of my new situation. It's going to be hard to avoid that, right? Or at least I will tend to see those who disagree with me as enemies to be eliminated or at least controlled, maybe thrown in jail. And adding maybe the kind of number one ego problem that we fall into if we don't work on ourselves. Again, I'm the all-powerful ruler, right? Will I be disposed to see the solution to all the social ills as simply imposing my superior judgment and wisdom on the situation, and all of you should just go along and do with what I say and everything will be okay, right? Because after all, I want a really good society. Just do what I say, right? My superior judgment and this attempt to impose my will. Unsurprisingly, though, if this is what's going on, right, the results of these kinds of motivations are very unlikely to bring about a kind of society that will be truly just. And of course, that doesn't apply only to authoritarian rulers. There's plenty of evidence, I think, that democracy doesn't work very well if it simply becomes a different system for certain individuals and groups to manipulate and exploit. You have to do it in a different sort of way. And it seems to me that's what we're experiencing now. So if we can never have a social structure so good that it obviates the need for people to work on themselves to be good, not to be motivated by the three poisons in Buddhism, right? Then our modern emphasis on social transformation, restructuring institutions to make them more just, right? That's necessary, but not sufficient. And that brings us to the Buddhist focus on personal transformation, right? Are you with me so far? Yeah? Okay. I started out by saying how at the very core of the Abrahamic traditions, there's this emphasis on morality, good versus evil. And of course, morality is important in Buddhism too, right? We have the 5 precepts people should follow, hundreds of additional rules for the bhikkhu and the bhikkhuni. But if we look at them in an Abrahamic way, I think we miss the fundamental point. Because there's no God telling us to live this way. It's very much the idea that, given the way karma works, if we live according to them, our lives will improve. We'll have better lives. But there's no external authority sort of requiring us to live in this way. It's not as though we're going to be punished by some God up there in heaven. So the precepts can be understood as aids to mindfulness, exercises in mindfulness as ways to train ourselves. And in a way, they can also be understood as like the training wheels on a bicycle, which eventually can be removed because the idea is they're to help us achieve a certain skill. And then once we've achieved that skill, we don't necessarily have to think about them or attempt to be following, but ideally they are very much incorporated into how we actually live, right? It's interesting that in the very first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha distinguishes what he calls elementary, inferior matters of moral practice, from other matters profound, hard to understand, experienced by the wise, right? He speaks this way because for Buddhism, the fundamental axis is not good versus evil, but it's something not moral, but more cognitive in the sense there's something to understand. The fundamental axis is, for Buddhism, is delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus enlightenment versus awakening. The idea is to become more aware, and at least in principle, someone who is awakened will naturally want to follow the precepts. That's the principle. Sadly, all of us here, I think, are aware of how often the teachers fall short of this, which raises some questions about how all this works, right? But this is the fundamental idea, that one who is realized wants to behave in this way, in a way that does not violate the spirit of the precepts, right? The Buddha said that he taught only dukkha and how to end it. And it's a really interesting question. Did he have in mind only individual dukkha, the way that we tend to understand it now, resulting from my own thoughts and actions, right? Or did he have maybe a wider social vision that would encompass what we might consider structural dukkha? The suffering caused by oppressive rulers and unjust institutions. And the reason I mention this, although we're not usually aware of it, some scholars of early Buddhism think that the Buddha was not trying to establish a religion in the sense that we think of it now. He was actually trying to transform society, that he was offering a vision that in the long run would transform the whole of society, a movement. And this reminds us then not to anachronistically project our idea of a religion back on him. Maybe he was doing something else. And there's a couple things that make me wonder about that. For example, his attitude toward caste and his attitude toward women, right? Both of which were extremely radical for his time. As you may know, when bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, when they joined the order, the monastic order, they lost caste. Which is a big deal, right? Because caste structured the whole way the social system worked in India. It said who you could marry, who you could hang out with, who you could touch, who you could share food with, right? You join the order, guess what? You become a beggar. You go out in the morning with your begging bowl, and you're not allowed to discriminate between an untouchable person or a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, whatever. You have to go from house to house. You're not allowed to make that discrimination, and you're not supposed to talk about caste in the sangha. That's very suggestive, I think, right? I mean, and then we know from the Pali Canon that people, apparently from all different types of castes originally, could awaken. So there's really this sort of, I don't know, do you want to call it democratic or egalitarian sense that everyone, regardless of their supposed social caste, has the same Buddha nature, the same potential to awaken. Not a small thing for his time. And the same is true, maybe even stronger, for his attitude toward women, right? At the time of the Buddha, the situation of women in India was not good, right? They weren't allowed to take part in Vedic rituals, for example. They could get in a lot of trouble if they ever would. You know, it was the men. It was a very, very patriarchal society. And what did the Buddha do? He actually created a separate sangha, a bhikkhuni sangha, for women. Again, in the realization, women have the same Buddha nature. They have the same potential to awaken. And actually, if you read the Pali Canon, there's something really weird about this. Do you know the story of how he created the woman sangha? His foster mother appealed to him and sort of kept appealing, and he said no, no, no. And finally, Ananda, his attendant, his cousin, said, in effect, to the Buddha, well, you know, don't women have the same potential to awaken? And the Buddha said yes. And he said, well, why don't you create a sangha for women too? And the Buddha said, okay, something like that, right? That's a bit simplified. The whole way that story is structured, it's very interesting. If you read the Pali Canon as a whole, it's very clear that the redactors, the people who, there's all kinds of stories about Ananda, and he's always shown in a bad light. The people who put it together did not like Ananda, Kashyapa, the guy who sort of took over after the Buddha. There seems to have been some really serious tension. And even that story that I just told you, it seems to be a way to blame Ananda for creating the women's order. Yes. And it's interesting that after the Buddha died, you know, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the women's order, it continued for a while, but then it faded away. Indian and those societies remained as patriarchal as ever, and you know, they weren't as enlightened as the Buddha, and they lost that. And my sense is the men didn't like the competition. I think that's part of it. Yeah. So again, what can we learn from that story? Well, I'm not sure in terms of social dukkha, but both his attitude toward women and caste is kind of very suggestive, isn't it? That he had awareness that dukkha is also structured in terms of the way society is organized, that it's not simply on the individual level. But again, the Pali Canon wasn't written down for 300 years. We don't know what's been left out. We don't know how it's changed. We have that Ananda story and some other ones. It's kind of hard to retrospectively go back. But the reality is, especially when you look at it, when you look at the early Buddhist Sangha in terms of its relationship with authority, with the kings of the time, the kings could crush the Sangha. The Sangha wanted not only to be tolerated, but it wanted to be supported. It wanted the kings and such to give, you know, land, buildings, money to keep the Sangha going. And so Buddhism never threatened the social order. It didn't do what Christianity, at least early Christianity, or rather early Judeo-Christian, right? It didn't get involved in that kind of prophetic way of challenging. So early Buddhism as an institution came to an accommodation with the state. And if you want to be supported by the powers that be, you'd better support the powers that be, right? That's the reality that they seem to have fallen into pretty early. And the fact that no Asian Buddhist society until modern times was anything like what we would call democratic placed limits on the type of dukkha that the Buddhist teachers could talk about. Do you see? Do you see how this would tend to, regardless of how it started out, historically the tendency then would be to focus on the individual level and not to raise questions about institutionalized dukkha, social, structural dukkha. The result being that we have this wonderful tradition or cluster of traditions which has created the world's, by far the world's greatest collection of contemplative practices that we can use in order to transform ourselves. But it's because Buddhism kept a kind of a low profile, right? Karma was understood on the individual level. Dukkha understood on the individual level due to your own karma, right? The karma in rebirth teaching, in fact, could be used, and it was used, to rationalize the power of the king. If someone's born a prince, they must have really good karma, right, from their past lifetime. And sorry, if you're born poor, disabled in some way, or a woman, well, you can't blame anyone else for that, right? You must have done something really bad in your past lifetimes, right? Very sad the way karma can be sort of manipulated in this fashion. The result is Buddhism survived and thrived, spreading throughout Asia, but it had to focus pretty much solely on the spiritual development of the individual, whether or not that was faithful to what the Buddha may originally have had in mind. Today, however, we find ourselves in a completely different situation, right? Or completely, anyway, quite a bit different situation. As I said earlier, Western ideals, at least the ideals, if not the reality, have spread. Modernity is sort of the Western way of thinking, largely globalized. Obviously not completely, but what I'm pointing at is at least lip service to human rights, to freedom of speech, and in a way that enables Buddhism to develop as it wants to. It doesn't have to be beholden to the state in the way that it has traditionally been in Asia. So Buddhism finds itself in a new situation. And we also have, I think, a much better understanding of what we can call structural dukkha, as I've been alluding to, right? Which opens the door to expanded possibilities for the tradition, which can now develop, and I think it has. So for example, one thing that I and some others have been talking about is understanding the three poisons not just in an individual way, but seeing them as institutionalized, right? I think I alluded to that earlier, the idea that greed isn't simply something that operates on the individual level, but in a way it's institutionalized, that is to say, it's taken on a life of its own. That if greed means you never have enough, that's a pretty good description of the way our economic system functions, quite apart from the intentions of any particular. That's what it means to take on a life of its own. If somebody in particular isn't sort of serving that function of helping the corporation maximize profits, what's going to happen? He or she will be replaced by somebody else who will. Again, the institutionalization means it's embedded, taken on a life of its own. And I think we can see that, and that we can see, it's like a whole new world has opened up for Buddhism in terms of how we can apply Buddhist teachings. And of course, we're going to be talking more. Most of the rest of this weekend, we'll be talking about the ecological implications of all of this, right? So to sum up, another way to understand and express this relationship between the highest ideal of the Western tradition, social justice, and the highest ideal of the Buddhist tradition, individual awakening, right? Another way to talk about it is in terms of freedom. And of course, that's something we're all so familiar with. Everyone's talking about freedom, freedom, freedom all the time, right? No one seems to talk about the other side of freedom, which is the responsibility not to infringe on the freedom of other people. People talk about, ad nauseum about the freedom to have guns, and no one seems to talk about the freedom of school children not to be killed by people having guns, right? Very one-sided. But think about what we've just expressed, how the emphasis of the modern West has been individual freedom from other people, but also especially oppressive institutions. A prime example being, say, the Bill of Rights appended to the US Constitution. Whereas the emphasis of Buddhism and many other traditions, Indian traditions, for example, has been on what might be considered spiritual freedom or psychological freedom. To put it most succinctly, is it freedom for the self or freedom from the self? Do you see? Freedom for the self, from a Buddhist perspective, there's something very incomplete about that, because we know the freedom of the ego self is going to get us into a lot of trouble unless we have some insight into how that's functioning. So, is it the case that we need both freedoms, and either freedom by itself is going to be insufficient? Right? I mean, I can think about a recent president of the United States who is extremely wealthy and basically can have anything that he wants, and yet he strikes me as a very unhappy guy. I'm not going to say who I'm talking about here. Very unhappy guy, and in fact, yeah, a pretty kind of sad, and I think many of us would think of him as a pretty poor example of a human being, who in one way he is as free, just about as free as anyone could be, at least until the courts catch up with him. And yet, because he doesn't have this psychological freedom of understanding his own ego, his own greed, ill will, delusion, and how it is that that makes him unhappy, in another way he's very, very unfree. But it's also important to look at it from the other side, to look at a situation like Myanmar, Burma, where on the one hand you have lots of Buddhist practitioners, lots of monastics who meditate and who might have a lot of insight into how their minds work, and yet they are oppressed by a very difficult, exploitive, violent government that really involves a small military elite controlling and taking advantage of the economic system. So in a way, this kind of summarizes what I'm trying to point to. We need both types of freedom. Either one by itself is inadequate. The West has emphasized the one. The East, especially Buddhism, has emphasized the other. And I think the great challenge of our time, which we're part of, is how to integrate the two, because that's going to happen. That's going to have to happen in order for us to kind of have the kind of future going forward that we hope for. Yeah. Does that make any sense? I think I'll stop there and maybe open things up to discussion, where, what people are thinking. In the back of the room.
I'm curious to know I'm curious to know your perspective on the Islamic tradition and the Chinese roots and foundations.
I don't know that I have anything especially interesting to say about either one. I mean, of course that's not going to stop me, right? But especially Islam, I think it's an example of what happens when religious traditions become very fundamentalist. And it's interesting, those of us who've read Karen Armstrong, she has a wonderful book on fundamentalism, making the point that the first really important version of fundamentalism was actually Christian, like in the US in the 19th century. But in any case, what's happened with Islam, within the movement historically, there have been some very progressive things going on. People often talk about what was happening in Spain in like the 13th and 14th centuries, where you had Muslims, Christians, Jews living together, and it was an incredible intellectual ferment where people were learning so much from each other. And there was this incredible cross-fertilization to Christian theology and mysticism. The greatest of all the Muslim mystics, Ibn Arabi, was born and raised in Spain. So what I'm trying to point to is within the Islamic tradition, it's a very rich tradition that has a lot to offer. And what's happened there, I think, is in a way an extreme example of what's happened here, that fundamentalists and evangelicals, in that case, especially funded by Saudi Arabia, among others, have really affected the tradition and made it, I think, very problematical. And partly fueled by reaction to Western colonialism, too. I mean, I think the people in the Middle East are aggrieved for a reason, given the way that some of the Western European countries have, taken advantage of them. Think of Iran, right? I mean, the way that we, if you know anything about our history of relating to Iran, the way that we basically overthrew a democratically elected president in order to install the Shah, a really nasty guy, but he was our guy. And, the Iranians have good reason for not being that enamored of the United States, right? So put those things together, and basically what I'm trying to say is I think there's a lot within the Islamic tradition that's to be appreciated, and it's developed in the way that it has. It's not the only way it could have developed or needs to develop in the future. Regarding China, I know somebody else wants to respond here, but regarding China, the important thing to remember is China's never had a democracy. And so look at it this way. The French had a revolution. What happened? They got rid of their king, and they ended up with Napoleon as the emperor, right? Germany had, they kind of overthrew, and they ended up with Hitler. Or you look at the Soviet Union, and they overthrew and killed their own royal family, the Tsar, and they ended up with Stalin. It's like there's a kind of a psychological, they seem to fall back into that same kind of top-down authoritarian structure. And I just see that happening in China. That because they never really had much of a tradition of democracy. There was a couple years, but not enough to actually make a difference. More and more I have the sense that there's something very fragile about democracy. It's kind of hard to keep it alive and requires a certain kind of people. And sadly, I don't see that likely in China anytime soon. They seem to revert slowly or not into this sort of top-down authoritarianism. Is that an answer to your question?
Well, I go back.
One moment. Let's grab the microphone here, please. Yeah.
I go back to your alluding to Chomsky's perspective, and I do think we need to really be aware that the crisis of our times is very complex, and be certain that we don't diminish much of the world's population and their perspectives, because I think it's equally complex to ours.
Yeah. I hope that nothing I said implied that it was simple. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, way back there. Please wait for the mic. Yeah, so our online people and in here people can hear you.
I think of the Emperor Ashoka, who I have often held up as an example of a Buddhist emperor who was a reformer.
Yep.
Created orphanages, public education,
Yep.
affordable housing. So there is, I think, in Ashoka, an example of social conscience acting in a Buddhist culture with inspiring results. So, short summary, what about Ashoka?
To a large degree, but not completely, I agree with you. The first thing to notice is that if you think about the world's great missionary religions, right? And throughout history, most religions have not been missionary. They're usually very ethnic, like Shinto in Japan or something like that. But if you think about the world's greatest missionary religions, all three of them were so successful because they became the religion of an empire. If you think about it, Ashoka helped a lot, but also Islam. Well, Christianity, the Roman Empire, and then Islam, they made their own empire as a way of sort of spreading the word, right? In the case of Ashoka, clearly he did some wonderful things, but we have to be a little careful because the only testimony we have to what he did is what he himself wrote on his pillars. So, it's a little bit tricky. We don't, the way, the problem in India is they had a problem with script. Things wouldn't last very long, and so unless you carved it on a panel or something, they were kind of late on that. And we don't have really much other data, although I have read stories about him sort of having a very extensive secret service network as a way to control the people. So how do you factor that in? I really don't know, but just kind of keeping that in mind. But clearly, you're right in the sense of the things that he said he did, and we have no reason to think he didn't do them. The things that he did were wonderful, and so in that way, he's an exemplar. And within the Buddhist tradition, he's always been the sort of model of a righteous ruler. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning him. Yeah. And of course, what happened is because it's top-down, because it's not democracy, after he died, and I don't remember if it took another generation or two, but then that dynasty is toppled and you get a Hindu emperor and it reverts to caste. And, even if you have a good emperor, a really good autocratic ruler, there's no guarantee that will last. But also, as I'm suggesting, there's no guarantee that democracy is going to last either. Yeah. Thank you. So did what I say, did it make sense? Did it seem relevant to me it seems really important, the need to bring both of these together, which is not to say it's easy, because how do you motivate? What makes people want to transform themselves? I'm thinking of a recent president who's very well, it's like, is this president going to want to meditate? Is he going to see the point of that? How do you deal with this kind of thing? It gets very complicated, doesn't it? Yeah. Please.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to go back to your discussion of good versus evil and how within this country we can look at, take any conflict, whether it's a debate about gun rights or reproductive rights. I think reproductive rights is a really good example where each side of that thinks that it is their battle against good versus evil, and the other side is evil. And I have conversations like this at home sometimes where my husband will rant about something and I'll say, but don't you realize they're saying the same thing about you? And how do you see something like this playing out where you have two sides that it isn't just acknowledging let's agree to disagree or we can still try and find something in common. It's you're bad and I'm going to get rid of you. How do we even work with that as a society?
What a great question, huh? How wonderful it would be if I or anybody had the answer to that, right? But let me give one more example, because I think it's very relevant. In the last few years, I've spent a lot of time studying evolutionary psychology and the way how sort of group selection works. That is to say, what keeps people working together, because in evolution, there's a tendency to sort of be individualistic in the sense of, what's good for me. And unfortunately, that can even apply. Sometimes greed, aggression can play a role in helping you reproduce in the competition and so forth. But what tends to temper that is group selection, in the sense that it's not just me or each of us against all, but our group against their group that wants our land, or maybe we want their land. But there's this sense of competition. And the important point is, historically, what tends to keep groups together and more inclined to sort of sacrifice at least a little bit for the group is the fact that you have the external enemy. And that if you're not good at cooperating, and they are, you're likely to lose in that kind of a struggle. And the reason I'm alluding to this, I think this is really very relevant to what's happened to our country since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the worldwide communism, right? What I mean is, until about 91, Americans had to come together, Democrat or Republican, they had to come together and work together, because the way we understood it, we were in this worldwide struggle against the evil commies, right? And that kept us united. And notice what happened. As soon as communism collapses, very soon thereafter, the split between the Republicans and the Democrats becomes really important. You get remember Newt Gingrich, the contract with America, and all that, right? The timing of that is no accident. There's no way that would have happened during the Cold War, because we had to keep a united front. But once they're not that threat, then the tendency to find enemies inside becomes stronger, and there's not that extreme motivation to stick together and to work together and to be altruistic and to sacrifice for the sense of the group. So I think that's another example of how in Buddhism we tend to talk about ego, but it's not just individual ego, right? There's group egos, and you were referring to some of these struggles. I immediately thought about abortion in particular. That's a significant example. I admit to personally having some trouble empathizing with the other side, because frankly, I can understand why, if you believe abortion is evil, well, that's fine. Then don't have an abortion yourself, right? If you believe that gay marriage is evil, well, fine. Don't marry somebody of your same sex, right? But why? It's like the idea of democracy and freedom. It seems so inconsistent. And yet, as you're saying, of course, because they have these particular kinds of values, perhaps rooted in a kind of in a weird, distorted way by the kind of evangelical Christianity that's become so important in this country, Jesus doesn't say anything about abortion or homosexuality as far as I know, and yet, it becomes a kind of a touchstone, yeah. In terms of dealing with that, I guess I just come full circle. And I don't think there are any simple answers, except on the individual level. I think it's essential for us to model the kind of behavior that we would like other people to adopt. And I think that's true in general, isn't it? All social issues. If we don't start with ourselves, I think there's a kind of hypocrisy. And when it comes to ecological issues, which we're going to be focusing on a lot more now, if we don't make the personal effort to reduce our own carbon footprint and live a bit more simply on this earth, then I think there's a fundamental kind of hypocrisy there. How far that goes, how quickly that's going to have an impact, if it will have any impact whatsoever, yeah, I wish I had an answer to that. That was an awful long way of saying I don't know, wasn't it? I'm sorry about that. Please, in the back of the room here, I don't know where the microphone is. Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay. You'll go back here and then over here, and then we should check online. So 2 from here, and then we'll check our online people.
Thank you. Our conversation tonight seems to me, we've given the context in Asia, and then, fast forward to the United States and our current political situation here, and all of the difficulties we're facing relating to each other now in healthy ways. I'm wondering if you can think of examples of where this is working, places we can look to and go, because we have this sense that we're the only folks who have the answers, in the U.S. We got it all figured out, and we don't have to listen to anybody,
That's part of our problem.
It's our way or the highway, We're the city on a hill, and we got her, But we know that's not the case, and we're not really good at listening at all. We're good at telling folks what to do, but we're not really good at listening. And I'm wondering if you can think of examples around the world where we really should be listening, and looking at what they're doing because it's working. They have healthier societies. And
when you say it's working, can you be a bit more specific? Are you referring to ecological issues or just more generally?
The way people relate to each other, do they do it in an authoritarian manner? Is it more egalitarian or democratic? There is something known as the happiness scale, and
we're pretty
just
down.
wondering
We're pretty low in that scale.
You bet.
As well, also life expectancy too.
Yeah, and it keeps going down here.
Yeah. Right.
That's. So I'm just wondering if you can think of examples around the world where, they might have something that we could learn from.
Well, I can think of a couple, but let me say, first of all, and I think this is worth mentioning, I teach a fair amount in Europe. My wife's English, and there's actually a lot of interest in Ecodharma in Spain, in Italy, in England, in Holland, and so I've responded to those requests. And what's interesting, talking to European Buddhists, they all say pretty much the same thing, that when they look at the sort of cutting edge of contemporary modern Buddhism, they look to us guys. They really think that, I know, they really think that somehow we're the ones on the forefront, and they're, as it were, learning from us, which is kind of a big responsibility, given that I don't always think we're doing such a great job, But I just wanted to mention that, the two examples that come to mind for me when you ask that kind of a question, one of them is something I think many of us are familiar with, how some of the North European, especially the Scandinavian countries, have much higher levels of reported happiness. It's tricky, right? Until recently, they haven't, they tend to be sort of monolithic societies in the sense that they don't have mixed cultures. And now that they are having a lot of immigrants, there does seem to be some resistance and reaction against that. So that just goes to show that it's much more complicated when you have a mixing pot or a salad bowl of different cultures and value systems. Yeah. But nonetheless, the self-reported happiness and also the life expectancy, it still suggests that they're doing something. And if you look at the idea of social democracy, I mean, it wasn't always this way in Sweden, but at a certain point historically, they decided for the well-being of their society as a whole to kind of rein in the capitalism and make sure that it wasn't kind of free in the way that it is here, but that it was really working for the benefit of everyone. So they have social democracy where much higher taxes on corporations and corporate profits and the very rich people. So, I mean, that we conventionally tend to distinguish very strongly between the political system and the economic system. And although I'm not a Marxist, I think this is one thing Marx got right in the sense that they're not two separate systems, right? They're very much interdependent, and one way or another, the other one is going to one is going to dominate and control the other. And I think a lot of the Scandinavian social democracies have done a lot better job in terms of the relationship between capitalism and the rest of society. So that's one example. The other example that, especially when you talk about ecology, recently I've had a lot of contact with some groups in Brazil. And I know people aren't so aware of this. There was this kind of social movement in Brazil some years ago, back in the turn of the century, when there were some very progressive things going on. But it's interesting, there are, within Brazil, a number of centers where they have created sort of collectives where they are trying to live in a kind of a sustainable, ecologically sustainable way. And I guess that comes to mind because I've been talking to these people and I've given some talks on Zoom for them. And they really do seem to have a model that for them is starting to work, but it's very small, But they have a number of interconnected, interlinked communities around a pretty broad area in Brazil, and they're definitely doing something right. And I look forward to visiting and finding out more about what that is. Yeah. I don't know if other people, this doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. Other people have other things in mind. Just a second, let's grab the microphone here. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, let's hear from that online person.
Two areas where we seem to be growing are in Buddhism and pagan traditions. We have sometimes 200 people attending some of our pagan rituals from all over the world. And our sangha has grown exponentially over the last couple of years. I was just wondering if you see a connection between the earth-centered religions and Buddhism and how we might intersect together to work on these climate crises. Sorry about the echo.
I think we could hear that well enough, right? Yeah. It's interesting how historically, think about European ideas about witchcraft and so forth, and how really it was part of this process whereby Christianity was labeling indigenous pagan, sometimes animistic, but sort of pre-Christian, more locally rooted spiritual traditions. It was part of labeling them as evil and then crushing them. And I think that although I don't know an awful lot about it, it seems to me that the pagan movement is definitely playing a role in helping us reconnect, with the natural world. And I can see that as potentially very important. And let me mention one more thing. What else might be playing a role? As you can probably guess, I'm a child of the 60s. And it's no accident, I think, that the psychedelic revolution of the 60s, and I'm not going to say any more about what role I may have played in that, but the psychedelic revolution of the 60s led to an explosion of interest and growth of Buddhist and Hindu and a number of meditation centers. Because the reality is, people take some of these psychedelics, and it's not like alcohol where you feel different, but the world literally changes. And it's an example of what I'm talking about, how we experience the world in the way that we do because of the way our mind works. And if our mind works differently, we're going to live in a different world, right? And I think for those who took psychedelics, they actually had an experience of that. It's tricky, people can get stuck there and, just hoping to get back to that, taking more and more drugs. But there were a number of people who realized that we need to move forward. And as Ram Dass said, the psychedelics are not a door, but a window, right? And that there's other ways, other mind developing processes, such as meditation, that can be very important. And this is starting to happen. A lot of it, I think, is undercover. In Colorado, psilocybin mushrooms are now decriminalized. And I think in Oregon too, maybe a few other places.
Yeah, in Oregon, psilocybin facilitators were recently licensed. We just had the first crop go through.
Great. And I don't know that we've gotten far enough to get into the licensing. But if I'm totally frank about my own perspective on this, the path of meditation can be very, very difficult. It can be hard for some people to get into. And I see this as a potential new direction for the Buddhist path, that for some people, this could be extremely helpful if it's done in the right way. I'm not suggesting sort of, let's throw the floodgates open. But I think this is one of these directions that maybe we need to explore, remembering, of course, that these psychotropic drugs were originally, and still are, very important parts of some, what we might call pagan or earth-based religions. Maybe we have something to learn from them, and maybe this is one of the things we can learn from them. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there, as I think this is something that may make a significant difference in the future as the 50-year drought where, this was illegal and people couldn't do stuff. I think now, thanks to people like Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind and all that kind of stuff. I watched, by the way, I recommend that Netflix series as well as his book, if you don't know it. New things are happening, and this is one of the new things. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know how it'll develop, how quickly, but I think it has some potential here to help us wake up, which is what Buddhism is all about. Yeah.
We have a comment next door here, and then let's begin to wind down so we can have a few minutes of break time before those who might like to participate in the 9 o'clock evening sitting.
Sure.
This comment goes back about 20 minutes, actually. We talked about political issues like abortion and pro-life and whatnot, and I think we're asking the wrong questions. Because the only way the few can rule the many, or one of the primary tools that I see, is division and distraction, right? And everybody wants to talk about, are you pro-life, are you pro-choice, are you the good, are you the evil? They got us very busy doing that sort of thing, like to the extreme right now. Are you black, are you white, is your gender something else, right? So we're very distracted, we're very divided, but we're asking the wrong questions. I think the question we need to be asking is why we have zero choice in any of this. It shouldn't be arguing about whether we're pro-life or pro-choice, for example. We should be asking why, It's somebody else's choice sitting behind a desk somewhere for all of us. And so it's just something that I feel strongly about, that everybody's arguing about the wrong things. It's why don't we have a choice? We don't choose anything. We have no choice in what the speed limit is, and what the curriculum for the next generation is in the schools. Name one thing that is of importance that you feel like you could influence if you're not a billionaire.
Looks like there might be a response to that. Just grab the microphone there, please.
Yeah, that mic is important for online people.
I was exposed to the movement of gross national happiness out of Bhutan.
Right.
And I think they've taken the issue to the UN. Could you comment anything about that movement? It really is not very familiar to most Americans.
Well, let me ask, are people familiar with this? Bhutan is a very small Himalayan kingdom. They have a king, and I think their foreign policy is kind of controlled by India, but nonetheless they're quite independent. And they've made this conscious choice not to simply follow the traditional Western economic development model, but they've emphasized a number of different things. I remember one of them that I really like is one of the criteria whereby they measure gross national happiness is gross national smiles. Ours just went up. So, I mean, I think this is important. Two quick comments, though. They're very small, and, you know, they're starting from a certain kind of social basis. It would be a lot more difficult. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but it would be a lot more difficult in a country like the United States, which is sort of overbig, to sort of adapt that. But we can appreciate them as a kind of a model that we don't necessarily have to evaluate everything according to the traditional economic markers.
Yeah.
The other important point is they have some political problems too. They have a number, I'm trying to remember the specific minority. I don't remember if it's Hindu or Nepalese. Anyway, they had a number of people living there, long-term refugees, and they actually haven't treated them very well. They've expelled them. So it's not as though it's an ideal country in every way, but clearly it has some important creative new ideas. Yeah.
Well, one of the policies they have is to limit the tourism to protect their environment. And I thought that was very creative use of Buddhist principles. And I talked to some of the leaders in Thailand. I was in contact with them, and Thailand's not anywhere near Bhutan, but they're trying to do some of the same things of preserving the land and preserving the species, and really in a reference to working with Buddhism.
Interesting. You know, if you've been to Thailand, it's got an awful lot of tourists. And, you know, you could even say kind of overrun with tourists. Whereas the reason we don't know more about Bhutan probably is that not many of us have been there, and for the good reason that you can go, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. So I think they've been very clever in the way that they've made sure that if you go, you're going to have to do it with a group and invest a certain amount of money that will work for the benefit of the society. Very clever and a good idea. Still, I regret that I haven't been able to afford to visit. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, let us give bows of gratitude and appreciation to David Loy. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.